started. We know that some people will filter in, but we have a lot to share with you, and we want to make sure we save time for your questions, so we're going to jump right in. There are handouts in the back of the room, including a handout that has all of our PowerPoint presentations in it, so it's a kind of a one-stop shop deal. I'm Cheryl Blanco. I'm with the Southern Regional Education Board. Thank you for joining us this morning. We would like to share with you one of the ideas in a little bit more detail that happened to come up in the previous session when Ohio Apollo was speaking about a different kind of transfer option. I am going to give you kind of a quick overview, and then we'll turn to the panelists. We have 4 individuals from 4 different states that are currently implementing or working toward the Passport project, and they'll be sharing some of their experiences in working with institutions and with the systems on making this happen. What's going well, where are some of the bumps, etc. So we wanted to give you a pretty broad background on the Passport. My job is to help you kind of understand what Passport is before they talk about their experiences. Are any of you from states that are currently engaged in the Passport project? Okay, 1, 2. Kind of hesitant. All right, well that's fine. Then maybe this won't be too redundant. Okay. Well, maybe it's this one. Maybe it doesn't work with this. Maybe.
I presented in here yesterday. I had to bring my own. It did work. We tried 2 computers, just if that helps you out.
Yeah, thank you. Then I will stick here.
Did you put the stick in it? Even with the stick in it?
Yeah. Maybe with the stick out, it works better. All right, very quickly, the Passport project, I call it the next generation of transfer. Because I've spent a lot of time in Florida, which was kind of the first state out with a guaranteed transfer program that was statewide. It's been around for 40 plus years. And I think the Passport project is the next generation because it will provide a guaranteed transfer of the undergraduate gen ed for students when they move from one Passport institution to another inside the state or outside the state. And many of us have some kind of transfer thing going on within our state. It's for those students who move out of state, or if they come to you from another state, that things begin to break down and transfer becomes less of a guarantee and maybe even sometimes a good deal for many students. So the Passport project overcomes that. It is a different kind of framework. It's been in the works now for about 7 years. So there's information out there. A lot has been done in the last several years. Have any of you attended a session in the last 3 or 4 years where we've talked about the Passport project? Okay, great, because we talked about it before, but this year it's obviously quite a bit more advanced. The goal, as you can see from the slide, I'm not going to read what's on the slides, but the idea is to protect the students and their credits. This is what the Passport project is all about. Ideally, that's what transfer generally is all about. As you can see, the funding has come from a variety of foundations to support this, and more recently, a very generous grant from the First in the World initiative from the federal government, very prestigious grant, and again goes to what we think is a strong support for the concept and being able to carry the concept to develop some evidence of success. The Passport project initially started a few years ago in the western states, and it came from the academic officers. So this really was born in the faculty. The Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, WICHE, was kind of a collaborating organization to help make it happen. So they're kind of the managing partner in all of this. But it's important to remember that this is a faculty-driven thing. This is not coming from the state, not coming from the nation. In phase 2, now we're finishing up a period of expansion, and that's when the other regions, like mine in the South, were invited to join, and that's why we have some states here from the South who are working now to make a determination on how well the Passport project fits or doesn't with what's going on in their states. Do we need to do something, or did we get it through?
It might be loading the driver, so.
Okay, then I will keep on going.
You see it black out? Don't stop.
Oh, right.
It's working, because that's how I.
This is called collaboration trust. A lot of trust. There's a lot of trust in Passport as well, right? A couple of key things about the Passport project I want to make sure that we hit on. And thank you very much, Stephen. Is it this way?
Yes.
Yeah. The Passport project, unlike other more traditional transfer, is built on learning outcomes, not on credits. And that is key, because it plays into competency-based education, prior learning assessment, and a lot of other things that are gaining a lot of ground, I think, in the States. And offsetting the outcomes are the performance criteria. Again, all of these are developed by faculty. They are not imposed, if you would, from any external source. Faculty teams worked in 9 areas. If you're familiar with LEAP, then that was kind of an overriding model that was taken into consideration and utilized to a large extent. As a former faculty member, one of the key things that I was interested in as I looked at Passport and whether or not to reach out to the southern states to get involved was the quality assurance. And I wanted to share with you these 5 areas that the Passport project has developed in order to work towards the quality assurance piece of this. The first is the work we're doing with the National Student Clearinghouse in developing the Passport Verify and the tracking system. Both of those are well underway, and a slide later will point out how they are being tested and modified this spring so that they're fully implementational in the fall. This is critical because we are crossing state lines. Some of us have had experience in trying to get transfer agreements between just a couple of states, and when I was doing this a little more actively in the West, it was the attorneys general that actually told us, no, you can't do that kind of thing. And that was kind of a shock. Fortunately, things have changed, and now it's much more possible, let's put it that way. A second piece of the quality assurance is work being done by NCHEMS, the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, and they're looking at the assignments to look at congruence and continuity and quality of assignments between one institution and another institution as kind of a backup. A third piece of this is kind of an ongoing tracking work that's being done by Rutgers University. That will get underway now as we're seeing more passports being awarded. The last 2 items on the list are more kind of general things. You have to have a seat, and that there is an oversight board made up of the faculty and other experts who kind of give guidance and provide support to the effort. Because we're talking about a lot of different states all over the nation. So this takes some thoughtful work. I'm going to kind of segue into the conversation that you'll have with the panelists, but I wanted to also remind you that this is a huge benefit for students for all the things listed here, but most importantly because it does provide that guarantee. But there are also good benefits for institutions and faculty. As I said, it's faculty driven, and the institutions, many of them use it as a recruiting tool. As was mentioned earlier at the very end of this past session, many states are seeing declining graduation numbers coming out of high school. Most states will see those numbers continue to decline for the next 5 to 7 years. And so what I fear in some ways is this kind of rampant cherry picking from one state to another, that it will only increase. So states are going to look to other states to bring in their students to increase their enrollments. And that's where a guaranteed transfer system really benefits everyone. In 2017, just to kind of wrap this piece up, we are seeing more passports being awarded in the institutions. We have a number of states engaged, and we have very active work going on for the quality assurance side. Now, I want to turn this over to the folks that are down in the trenches, if you would, working with this. We'll start with Tom Steen. Tom is from North Dakota, and he represents a state that has been in this from the beginning. And he can share with you some of the, in his 7 or 8 minutes, some of the experiences that they overcame, barriers, or how they work with faculty to bring this about. He'll be followed then by Paul Smith. Paul is with Virginia, working with the SHIELD office there and talking with his states. Paul is representing a state that's been on board now for about 2 years, close to 2 years, in this second wave that came in as the South joined this movement. After Paul, Stephen. Stephen is with is a consultant working with the Arkansas Department of Higher Education to bring this into outreach. You can see there are different models, different ways that states can approach this. And then our backup is Ken Sauer. Ken, you may have heard earlier, is with the Indiana Commission, SHIO office. Again, one of the states that came in the last couple of years. So let me turn this over to Tom and get started.
Okay. So as Cheryl said, North Dakota has been in the passport from the beginning. So we've been part of the development of the passport and the early stages, the piloting of the passport. One of the neat things about the passport is it comes with a full support system, which has been developed along with the learning outcomes. So a little bit about North Dakota. You know, it's a relatively small state, 5 two-year colleges, 4 regional, relatively small universities, and 2 research universities, about 15,000 apiece. So that's our structure. We've got we've had a couple of features that have helped us work with the passport. One of those is that we've had a long-standing transfer agreement, general education requirements transfer agreement, since the mid-90s. And of course, that's a classic transfer agreement for the transferring of credits. The passport is an effort to move beyond that, but in North Dakota, we like that transfer agreement, so the trick then is to marry the passport to the GERDA without interfering. Recently, we've started a council for general education, the North Dakota Gen Ed Council, and that's been the group of faculty and staff where a lot of the passport development has grown out of. That's a relatively new group for us. At the same time, North Dakota became a LEAP state about the same time the council began, 2009-10, I think. And we were involved in LEAP state efforts, the AAC&U's quality collaboratives, and now they're faculty collaboratives, some of you will be familiar with those. And that's been important in North Dakota, understanding what's going on in the larger context of things. And then we had, in the development, we had 4 of our 11 institutions actually piloting the passport. So as the passport's been developed in its early stages, it went through a pilot phase, and 4 of our institutions did that. So gives you a little bit of backdrop. The big decision for us has been the shift from the development work of the passport, which we have engaged a lot in. The other states are coming in after the development of the passport, and then shift over to joining the passport. The passport, as Cheryl said, is just kicking off in the last half year or so, and it's a network of members, kind of like the NCAA is for athletics, and it will become a network of members either institutions or systems. And North Dakota's big choice was, do we join as a system, all 11 together? South Dakota did that, Utah did that, 2 of the other developing states. Or do we join individually? North Dakota felt that we were different enough institution to institution that we would join each one independently. That for us was a linchpin decision. And since that time, my job's been to reach out with each individual campus and work with those who were interested, those who were on the fence, and so on. And that's been the bulk of our work over the last, I'd say 9 months or so, and will continue to the end of this year. And so through the council, the NDGE, the council, their faculty group very much encouraged initial membership. But among the pilots, there were concerns, especially among our smaller schools, for the amount of record keeping that they were doing, especially record keeping by hand or complicated. And so that was a workload issue for them. Since that time, their feedback has been instrumental in the passport smoothing out and making the record keeping more efficient, it's been passed on to the National Student Clearinghouse now instead of being a passport only record keeping. And then each state is looking at their state system, technology system. We're doing that in North Dakota as well. So where are we now? Sorry for the small slide. Of our 11 institutions, 2 institutions have joined, have done the work to do that. 3 or 4 more are on the fence. The 2 joiners are a community college, Lake Region Community College, very small community college. That was one of the pilots. And the University of North Dakota, which was not one of the pilots, but is one of our major research institutions, and the one that had its Gen Ed program keyed to learning outcomes a few years ago. So it was an easy transfer or switch for them. The council will continue to look at general education and transfer issues, and that will become kind of the place where a lot of discussions will take place. And then those 2 institutions not only have started to join the passport, but they've taken the lead in helping the rest of the state, in fact the nation. UND is piloting the new record keeping system through the National Student Clearinghouse. Cheryl mentioned it, Passport Verify it's called. And then UND is also developing the North Dakota State Technology System to tag automatically passport students as they earn them, or students who are on the way to earning a passport, and be able to do that automatically, solving or addressing those problems that the pilot institutions have. Lake Region is also piloting the passport recording system. And the other thing, the last thing I'll mention is we have strong interest in North Dakota to link up with the neighboring states. South Dakota has joined, Minnesota has not, and that would make a big difference for us. And so there's a kind of a factor for consideration in the passport, both for individual states and individual institutions, as well as the passport as a whole. So I'm passing it on to Paul.
Thanks, Tom. Well, glad to see everybody made it, and thankfully we're not after lunch yesterday, so yeah, I'm glad to see everybody's still awake. I am Paul Smith. At least last time I checked, I work for the State Council of Higher Education for Virginia. I have this wonderful long, really long title there. I still ride my boss because half the time I forget about what my title is. I like to be referred to though as a transfer czar. So, haven't got into the final on that one yet. So I was tasked with putting together, or working with our institutions to put together this passport process that Cheryl had described. Cheryl approached us along with a couple of other states, and ultimately we signed on for a couple of reasons. One was our community college system has a 30 credit hour, 33 credit hour general certificate of education that students can earn in that first year. Well, we felt that the Passport Initiative would align nicely with that, so it would help our internal students transfer over, those being our largest population of transfer students in the first place. Annually, we probably end up with about 10,000 of those students transferring without their associate degree. And what we realized over the years was that those students didn't have a lot to kind of fall back on. They were at the whims of the institutions to go through, nitpick all their credits, and they were kind of subjected to the whims of the institution. So we were hoping that this would be able to help them out. A quick rundown on what SREB does. We are more of a coordinating body. We act more as a mediator between the legislature and the institution. We do not have central governments. The only way the institutions are mandated to do anything is through legislation. And usually it's make this happen in coordination. Most of our legislation says SREB is to coordinate with the institutions to develop XYZ policy. So we spend a lot of time working with the institutions and making sure that they're on board. This General Assembly session has been quite hectic for us, so the next couple of years will be extremely busy. We do have a community college system. Amongst our 15 four-year schools, like I said, we're acting more as a federation. Our community colleges, we do have 23. Those are under a system, so it makes it a little easier to work with them. And then we have our one lone junior college. It's Richard Bland College, and they're associated with William and Mary. And so ultimately, we're dealing with quite a number of schools and trying to make everything happen nicely, yes.
What's the difference between the one junior college and the community college?
They have residency. That's really the difference between them and our other community colleges. As far as what we're legislatively mandated or our transfer environment, we have guaranteed admission agreements. They came into play 2006 or so. I think that's when the legislation passed. And that's a system-wide agreement. So all of our four-year institutions, our public four-year institutions, are required to have these guaranteed admission agreements, which are nothing more than maybe an articulation agreement on steroids. So the students completing the threshold admission process, and it's usually a GPA requirement. So if the student has a 2.0 and an associate's degree, there's no review of their application. They're automatically admitted to a particular institution. So the lowest being 2.0, the highest institution requiring a 3.8. So it just depends. Each institution set their own standards, but all of our public four-year institutions have this. And obviously we have our articulation agreements. Those are more locally developed, program-specific. Last count I tried to put together, we had 225, 250. Those were the ones I could find. But both of those items were designed to help the person with the associate degree. What are we doing for those students who transfer without it? So when we rewrote our state policy on college transfer this past 2 years, we just got it implemented this past year. We included a clause in there to try to help those students. And we felt the passport was going to be a way to possibly help those students. And when we started into this, we tried to figure out a way to identify which institutions were going to participate. So what we did is we looked at some of our 2016 budget amendments, and ultimately what came out of that were 6 institutions that were targeted for additional funding by reducing the number of freshman admittance but subsequently increasing the number of transfer admittance, so hopefully boost their graduation rate. So we selected those 6 four-year institutions. We had 1 additional institution volunteer, and then the community college system selected 5 feeder, or the 5 feeder community colleges for those institutions that were up there. We didn't force the institutions to participate. We worked through their provost. They all volunteered to participate, and that's how we ended up where we were. I went to each one of these institutions, all the way from the Tidewater region, all the way to the Kentucky line to all of our institutions. And I sat down with their faculty panels that were going to be charged with this process and explained to them what the circumstances were. Again, not one shoe fit everybody. Everybody was a little different, had different questions and different concerns. So I discussed the initiative. We had multiple ways in which people were going to approach this, or institutions were going to approach. Some had a specific passport committee, others worked through their general education committee, and then some of the community colleges used their general education certificate, so the individual did it. And then subsequently vetted it through their process, or through their committees. We did not involve the registrars or any of the admissions office as of yet. We thought that might have been a little premature. If the institution was not going to sign on, why get those other folks involved? So that was how we started. As it's worked its way through the system over the last 18 months or so, we've gotten a little bit of mixed response. Many of them believe that it does simplify the transfer process. It does promote a seamless transfer for that population of students who really have nothing to hold on to. It does, and then it aligns nicely with the community college system's general education certificate. So those were all the pros. The cons, the faculty were concerned about the limited amount of data on student success post-transfer. They were concerned about the loss of governance, even though they have an opportunity to participate in the governing process once they sign on as an institution. They were still concerned that they were not involved in developing the learning outcomes. Other things we run into were equitability concerns between the passport and our guaranteed admission agreements. Virginia is real funny about its extra institutional learning. It's CLEP, it's AP, IB, prior learning assessment. Our institutions all vary. If you ever tried to figure out whether your son or daughter's AP credits are going to transfer into one of our institutions, you better do a lot of research, because it varies. And there's my time, I gotta wrap it up. But, and others felt that it was another level of assessment. So all these concerns really weighed on the committees and the individuals involved in the process. So as we concluded, I still am waiting to kind of hear back from a couple as to what they're planning to do, but we had 3 that just said absolutely not, we're not interested. They gave me a letter stating such. 2 that were interested but felt participation at this time was premature. They're undergoing a gen ed review and revision, so they felt anything they did today would be completely new tomorrow. And then 2 interested but are kind of waiting for the pilot to wrap up and what the conclusion of that's going to bring. As far as our 2-year institutions, we had 3 that were not interested, and then we had 2 that were interested. Interesting about the 2-year institutions, the 2 that were interested were in more of a rural part of the state rather than the urban part of the state, but ultimately they're not making the decision, the system office is, based on their feedback, so we'll see how that goes. With that, I'm going to happily turn it over to Stephen and answer any questions at the end if you have any.
Paul, thanks a lot. Good morning, everybody. So I'm a little in a different position than the other presenters. I am a consultant for the Arkansas Department of Higher Education. So I just want to take a minute and let you know a little bit about who I am. I have been in higher education for over 30 years. I have been an advisor. I have been a transcript evaluator. I've been a faculty member. I've been a vice president of student affairs, so chief student affairs officer. I've been the chief academic officer, and I've been a college president. I have been, and I've worked at 4-year universities, and I've worked in community colleges. I have seen the impact of transfer on students, either from my institution, particularly of community colleges, to 4-year universities, and in the receipt of transfer students. So when the opportunity for me came to do this work for the Arkansas Department of Higher Education, I really jumped on because I really bought into the idea, as Cheryl explained it. I think there's so much possible benefit for our students. You know, the research is showing that transfer students do take about 1.2 more years to complete than those who don't transfer. It costs over $10,000 more for them to do that, and they are retaking classes that they essentially have already taken. Anecdotally, we have anecdotes in Arkansas of people who've been like in the military, who have taken 10 humanities courses to get their general ed humanity requirement finally acknowledged, because every time they moved, the humanities course they had on their books would not be accepted. So I think this is a really good issue for us to be looking at. So Arkansas is not a system. We have individual, locally controlled institutions. We also have a nice, interesting mix of those 2-year colleges that are affiliated to a 4-year institution, mainly the University of Arkansas and Arkansas State, and then we have those that are independent. The Arkansas Department of Higher Education is kind of an umbrella for all of higher education in Arkansas, including private institutions. So that's why I put the private up there as well. And we have 2 2-year colleges that are private and 10 4-years. Arkansas is bordered by 6 different states. Interestingly, none of those 6 states are currently participating in the Interstate Passport Initiative. And I'm going to ask, is there anyone in the room from any of these 6 states? Awesome, let's talk, because I'd love to have another state nearby. So we are, so you might ask, why are we doing this? And so let's get to that. Kind of the history of where Arkansas has been with general education requirements. Back in 2004, there was a lot of concern in the state of Arkansas about how students were able to transfer, and mainly they were having trouble transferring. And this was trickling up to the governor and to legislators. And one of the problems was that no one in the state seemed to have a common course numbering system or identifiers for general ed courses. They were called different subjects and they had different abbreviations and different numbers. And then they also were not being accepted. So in 2004, about 14 chief academic officers from 2-year and 4-year institutions got together, and they started to address this issue of transfer. And they had certain goals, and one of the goals was to reduce barriers for students to maximize their attainment, and secondly, to address concerns that were coming up and coming back to the institutions about transfer concerns. And they wanted to help identify a continuing process of how to deal with course transferability. And particularly in trying to reduce the amount of articulation agreements that were needed. The legislature got involved, and Act 672 of 2005 was passed by the legislature, and that was to create the Arkansas Course Transfer System. In March 2006, faculty from 2-year and 4-year institutions got together, and they identified not only common course course prefixes and course numbers for all of the general education courses, 88 of them, and then also identified common course descriptions, common learning outcomes for those classes. They also said they will open this up to more general education courses in the future. Interestingly, that was in 2006, we had 88. Today, we have 89. So we did add one, and that was 2 years ago. Articulation agreements still exist, and they still are problematic because inevitably, when the personnel changes, then sometimes the articulation agreements get called into question. Interestingly, and we have seen this in the work that I've been doing. I was in California yesterday working with a college on their passport block. And they were fine about developing their block that could be sent to everybody else. But they were like, now wait a second, we have to accept the block from other people? But what if they don't do the due diligence that we do? And I explained to them that that is a very common human reaction, and that they should not shy away from those questions, and that they should really delve into what would those quality assurance issues be. And I think that's one of the beauties of the passport, is those quality assurance issues that Cheryl talked about. So articulation agreements are still one of the motivators for us in Arkansas. And then this was the reason why our director of the Department of Higher Education 18 months ago wanted to be a part of the Passport Institute. He really saw the future was we needed to move away from this course-by-course analysis of transferability and get to the idea of learning outcomes. And really focusing on that, he saw that as the future. And his passion about that was so great that, I'm kind of jumping ahead, that we have 33 public institutions. Of those 33, 15 of them wanted to be a part of this, and he had to cut it off at 15. He had more that were interested to be involved. That's what really drove this. And then the idea that we have just enacted performance-based funding. And part of the performance-based funding is the number of transfer students that either as a 2-year college you send out or as a 4-year institution you receive. So anything that we can do to facilitate transfer would be ideal. This gives you the 9 blocks of the passport block. The bottom 3 are the foundational skills. The top 3 and creative expressions are the conceptual knowledge. And then critical thinking and teamwork kind of cross-cut across the curriculum. And these are the areas that the faculty work on. And the next slide will tell you. So the initial, oh, it doesn't, I'm sorry. The initial interest, I just told you. The current involvement is one of our lessons learned. While we had 15 that were interested, we have had a lot of changes in leadership in the last year, including the Director of Higher Education. And so while we had 15 interested and more kind of in the wings, we now have 3 universities and 3 community colleges that are still working on it, and I wouldn't bank on all 6 of those completing the project. So what are some of the lessons learned? Organizational systems matter. Because we are not a system, how each individual institution approaches this makes a huge difference on its success. The state of institutional general education review and revision. We had a university very interested in doing this, but they had just revised their general education about 5 years ago. And they said, we are not opening up that can of worms again. So they backed out. We have one institution that's reviewing it right now, and what they're going to do is build the passport blocks while they do the revision. Because they're already looking at it, let's do it all at once. And then the pros and cons of an alliance versus a statewide system. I think that for the pro, we've been seeing a lot of creative ways that faculty are building these blocks. Kind of the con is even our institutions that are not part of a system are looking to the Department of Higher Education and saying, can you give us kind of a cheat sheet on what you think the passport block could be, and we'll just say yes. So I think there's still kind of a desire on the parts of our institutions to do that. And then the leadership transitions are either creative disruptions or they're creative destructions. And for us in our institutions, it has been both. It has totally stopped institutions working on this project, and for others, it has been an opportunity to re-engage new leadership in this effort and ideas. And I will turn it over to Ken.
Thank you, Stephen. Ken Sauer, Senior Associate Commissioner and Chief Academic Officer with the Indiana Commission for Higher Ed. Indiana has 7 public institutions. There are 5 university systems that have a total of 13 campuses. One thing I will note is that we have a statewide community college system, Ivy Tech Community College, which is unique in that it is accredited as a single institution, which makes the full work of transfer a lot easier. We want to involve some of the private institutions in this work. We regularly involve them in transfer discussions, but at this point, with respect to the passport, we're pretty much focusing on the public sector. Indiana has had a number of statewide initiatives that are focused on competencies. I won't go through this whole list, but I will point out one. And that is, in 2012, the General Assembly passed a law that mandated a statewide transfer general education corps that was to be developed by the institutions in collaboration with the Commission for Higher Ed. A year later, that corps was completed, and I'm going to be talking about that because there are a lot of parallels with the WICHE Passport Initiative, although these were totally independent at the time. So, the process that we followed for developing this Gen Ed Corps is that we assembled a leadership team from all of the public institutions, and out of those discussions came a consensus that we needed to focus on 6 competency areas, and I'll focus on those in a minute. But once those 6 were identified, there were faculty panels that were created in each one of those 6 areas, co-chaired by a university faculty member and a community college faculty member, and they developed learning outcomes at a fairly high level in each one of those areas. So it turned out that we have about a half a dozen or so high-level student learning outcomes, depending upon which competency area you're talking about. Then finally, the institutions then took those competencies back to their campuses and identified courses that would lead to mastery of those competencies. So they took the competencies, mapped them into courses, and basically had a core, they had identified courses that students could take that would lead to completion of the core. I should say the core is statewide, which is to say that if you complete the core at one public institution, and you're admitted to another institution, you can transfer that core as a block, and it will satisfy the equivalent core at the receiving institution. I'll also add that when we got to that third step of actually mapping the competencies into courses, there was a consensus that the Gen Ed core ought to comprise 30 semester credit hours. But I really want to stress that steps 1 and 2 were taken without any reference to courses. The focus was on what do students need to know and do with that knowledge, what competencies and student learning outcomes do they need to have in order to have this Gen Ed core. These are the 6 competency areas that are in the core. The foundational intellectual skills, as we call them, written communication, speaking and listening, quantitative reasoning, are very close to the value rubrics, AAC and U value rubrics in these areas. And if you were to look at the student learning outcomes in those 3 areas, while there are some differences, and of course our faculty felt they were improving the value rubrics, you will see that there is a close correspondence to them. The ways of knowing, scientific, humanistic, and artistic, and social and behavioral, were unique to Indiana. As far as I know, at least, there were no reference points that were used in developing the student learning outcomes in those 3 areas. Now, why did we want to participate as a state in the WICHE Passport Initiative? And I should say we're still in the evaluation phase. No institution has signed on. From a commission standpoint, this was an opportunity to validate and perhaps improve our Gen Ed core. That core was put together over the space of a year. I think the institutions did an incredibly good job in developing that core and the learning outcomes under those competency areas, but you'd like some validation of that, and if there are ways in which we could improve the core, we certainly would want to do that. Beyond that, I really think that the Passport Initiative and initiatives like it are the future, competency-based. Courses and credit hours aren't going to go away tomorrow, and who knows, we may have them forever, but clearly the focus is on competencies, and that will only deepen in the future. Cross-state efforts are proliferating. Their students cross state lines, we have online learning, but more important than that, we have a lot more national and regional conversations going around that involve multiple states, and this was another important characteristic that attracted us to this. And finally, this resulted in a credential. Somebody has on their transcript an indication that they have completed the WICHE Passport. We have the same thing, by the way, with respect to our Gen Ed core, but once again, with the focus on stackable certificates, certifications, badges, all of that will continue to be an important part of our, I think, a growing part of the higher education landscape. And again, that was another feature that attracted us to this. So how does the Indiana Gen Ed core and the WICHE Passport align? I think with respect to the foundational skills, they're pretty close. Now, the faculty still need to dig into those, but I think there's a very close correspondence, at least in my view. When you look at the ways of knowing, or in the WICHE Passport jargon, the knowledge of concepts, although we have 3 categories, WICHE has 4, I think as you look at those student learning outcomes, you'll see a lot of similarity. Now, there is one big difference, which is a major hurdle to getting some equivalence between our Gen Ed core and the WICHE Passport, and that is in the science area. We have an approach that is more generic, that is focused on, well, it's important that students know about science, the scientific method, etc. In the WICHE Passport, there is a requirement that students have content knowledge in the life sciences as well as the physical sciences. Although it is very interesting, as you look at the 14 student learning outcomes under the WICHE Natural Sciences area, there is only one of them that makes an explicit reference to both the life and the physical sciences. In all of the others, the language is very generic, like the Indiana approach. So we're hoping that we can reach some way of accommodation there, but it is a major sticking point. The cross-cutting skills in the WICHE Passport are not explicit in the Indiana core. We actually, as the core was put together, there was a proposal to include a 7th competency area in critical thinking. The leadership decided that at least at that point it would be better to try to incorporate critical thinking into the other 6 competency areas. I personally disagreed with that, but in the spirit within which we approached the development of this core, my job as the academic officer at the commission was to support the process, to keep the process moving, ask a lot of questions, but in the end, it was up to the institutions to identify those competency areas. So we abided by that. I think this is an opportunity to revisit that. The Gen Ed core in Indiana doesn't have teamwork built into it. It's very ironic. I was at a faculty conference yesterday. One of our members of the commission is a faculty member. That's by statute. And by custom, the faculty member convenes a faculty conference once a year or once every 2 years. And that was held yesterday. It was focused on career skills and competencies that students ought to know. And it was teamwork was repeatedly mentioned as something that ought to be cultivated, even beginning with the foundational Gen Ed core. And I was delighted because it was only later in the conference that I did reference the WICHE Passport, but totally independently, the conversation led in the direction to cultivating teamwork. So I'm optimistic that we might be able to incorporate teamwork as an explicit competency or student learning outcome, area of student learning outcomes in the Indiana Gen Ed core. I've really just described, this slide pretty much described what I just said. You know, we've got to look at some of the details still. We have the business of one science discipline versus 2 science disciplines, attention, critical thinking, and teamwork. The 4th point is important. Given Indiana's Gen Ed core, which transfers and counts as a block and as an equivalent to the receiving institution, it would be great if we could make a statewide decision on the passport, and I hope it would be favorable, but ultimately it's up to the individual institutions. And we're not at that point yet, but we're getting close to it, and these are the next steps that I hope will drive us to a conclusion. There is a meeting later this month on the natural sciences. Indiana sent 2 faculty members, one from a community college and one from a university. They will be sending them to Boulder at the end of this month to talk about this very issue of 1 science versus 2. So we'll see what happens as a result of that. They're also planning a major statewide convening. We haven't settled on the date yet. It will probably be in May, and we'll have some WICHE representatives coming out to that. And I hope we can dig into the challenges that I described before. And then finally, and this is probably the right way to approach this, we'll sort of reassemble our leadership team. By the way, in addition to the statewide Gen Ed core based on competencies, we've done the same thing with 2+2 articulation agreements in 15 discipline areas. work exactly the same process, focus on, they're all built on the Gen Ed core, the first 30 hours, built the next 30 hours in the major. Again, all talk of courses were banished in that work until the very end. So you have a leadership team that with representation from all of our public institutions. That's probably the best way to come to some conclusion about this. Of course, it will be based on faculty engagement at each one of the institutions, but at some point we've got to bring everybody together and try to come to some conclusion about whether or not we will join. I certainly hope it will be a favorable outcome, and I think as one of those earlier charts signified, the work done very independently had a lot of convergence, and I think that sort of underscores the fact that when we're talking about some of these foundational skills and ways of knowing, content areas and so on, and some of these cross-cutting skills, there's a lot of similarity and overlap among states and institutions in this area.
Thank you. Well, now it's your turn. I see you. Questions, comments? Yes.
So I'm wondering, and this might be particularly for North Dakota, but it could be for all of you, but I'm wondering if you're working with the passport, given that you've had a Gen Ed agreement already within your state, has it helped to support more seamless transfer within your state? And then particularly since you've had 2 community colleges sign on to the passport, but now because of universities in your passport or in your state, I'm wondering if that plays a role in that, within the state.
Yeah, so I answered the last one first. The 2 that have signed on, one is a research university and the other is a 2-year college.
Okay.
And of the 3 or 4 that are considering, one of those is another 2-year institution, and a couple of the regional 4 years. So there is a 2-way. The first one, I think we don't know yet whether transfer is better, but that's the goal. One of the concerns, and I didn't talk too much about the motivation of our schools to join or to be interested in the passport. One of them is, even with our long-standing transfer agreement and common course numbering, the campuses still feel like there's too much course repeating, especially the 2-year colleges, and that in spite of that, and they see the passport as a way to help that a lot. And I think that's a real important motivating factor. The other motivating factor, I think Steve mentioned it, we've got a number of schools that are revising or want to revise their Gen Ed program and see the passport as a vehicle for doing that, especially because the ways North Dakota's been talking about revising Gen Ed is all about moving away from courses toward learning outcomes, competencies, whatever language you want. And the passport comes with that built in. The challenge, of course, is can we join those particular outcomes? But by and large, that's been far less of an issue than joining. So smoothing out transfer yet is a goal at the passport.
Other question, yes.
Yeah, depending on the demographics, and I'm most familiar with Virginia, but I used to work in a state that really had a declining population in general, a very old, the oldest state in the nation. So is there concern when you talk about this at the state level is actually sort of that out-migration and that you are potentially losing students for your state 4-year institutions? And maybe conversely, Virginia or some of the others, that these students from other states may be taking spots away from residents?
I'll chime in for us. I know there's been some concern, I will not name particular institutions,
I know you mean.
but that they have had to be reminded on several occasions by legislators that they are still public and state schools, and that they are required to take X percentage of in-state students. So that being said, one of the things, and I hope I'm going to get to your question with this, one of the things that came up in discussion when we were discussing this at the state level was, you know, I know National Student Clearinghouse that WICHE uses their map of transfers in and out of the state. You know, some of our internal data show that it's not 17%. It may be 17% going both ways, but most of that is coming into our schools. And so when we looked at it from that perspective, some of the schools that are participating were concerned, why were we going to develop this and encourage our students to leave? And so, you know, some of them viewed it as a recruitment option. Unfortunately, the ones that viewed it as a recruitment option are the ones undergoing the Gen Ed revision. So they're not going to pursue it at this time. But, you know, that's in general what the thought processes were around the in and out migration of the students. One of our community colleges, Mountain Empire, sits right at the border of Kentucky, and they were really hoping that Kentucky would sign on board as well, because they do have their students, some of their students, cross the state line, because it's about equidistance between the Kentucky school and UVA-wise. So some of the schools viewed it in different perspectives, I'll say that, in terms of in and out migration.
Three things very quickly. Ken, I just had this fantasy, my age, this is what you fantasize about, that if your state were to adopt teamwork as part of your general education, I would think that would be a boon for economic recruitment, because employers, companies, want to be connected to post-secondary educational systems for which that is a specific outcome. I hope you keep pushing that.
And John, I just want to say that at the theme of the faculty conference was college and career, and there was a lot of the discussion was around the skills that employers need, and that's how teamwork became such an important part of that discussion.
Thank you. And Stephen, it's not my position to invite you to do this, but I hope you'll write something, an article or a book or a session at next year's meeting to give us more insights into the distinction between creative disruption or creative destruction, because it sounds like it's all about leadership. I'm curious at what levels of leadership, and if they're correlates with personalities, disciplines. You know, a lot of us watching the White House right now and thinking about that. And finally, Paul, quickly, were you confirming the assumption that we might have had that the resistance for those who don't want to play in the sandbox might be correlated with institutional wealth and institutional selectivity? And if you were, aren't those the kinds of institutions that most need to diversify? And transfer is a way to do that.
Those same institutions that do not play well with others are oftentimes not concerned about diversifying and do not want to come to the sandbox. They have their own. And I will say that those institutions were not part of the pilot process.
Those are the institutions
Those are the ones that, yes, that we have to continually remind.
Yeah. Question in the back?
From the States, are any of you hearing from high schools about interest in this? In the passport, like through colleges offering courses in high schools happening more and more, it seems like this could be really attractive to a high school, senior picking up and then taking the passport wherever they want to go to college.
Not yet in North Dakota, but there's talk about doing that. It's still pretty new, right? Schools have just signed on, and in fact, the two North Dakota schools won't issue passports until the fall, so just a little too new yet.
Okay. In Arkansas, it's actually been the question, we accept those concurrent enrollment courses as meeting the Gen Ed, but now are they going to meet it to the passport learning outcomes level? And some concern, again, that trust. We all need to trust that these learning outcomes are happening, but what drives the ability to keep working on that trust is the verifying that the actual learning is taking place and there's success at the next level.
And Indiana does have a very extensive dual credit and early college system, and we support this very strongly at the state level. There are some high schools in which a student could complete the gen ed core, and that would transfer. Now, the question of passport hasn't come up yet, but that would be a logical next step.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar, but it seems like maybe the passport could be an incentive to expand college in a high school, but so that would be good for more enrollments for the colleges offering that, but it might encourage more out-of-state college going, which so there's it might be a tension there with the local colleges. So.
Well, it's 11 o'clock. Unless you have a burning question, we probably want to let you out the door. We'll unlock the door so you can. Please remember to do the evaluation, and please say thank you to our panelists.